Welcome, everyone. It's 11 o'clock Central Time. I'm Pat Greco. It's really a pleasure to be joined with by Ashby, my colleague, friend, fellow superintendent, leader for a long time. We're going to spend about 30 minutes having an important conversation. Invite you to join us again next week. We have some exciting colleagues that'll be joining us as well. So today, it's always a thrill as we start the school year and we think about setting up your new leaders, setting up your team for that deep level of success as we're entering into the new school year. I'm Pat Greco, served as a superintendent in public education for 38 years over the course of my career. And like you, have had a number of roles from assistant principal, assistant superintendent, and now I have the great fortune of working with my colleagues and teams from across the country as an improvement coach and support team member within student education. I live just outside of Milwaukee. My husband and I and our family is all in the metro Milwaukee area. Over the course of my career, I've worked in urban, suburban, and rural settings. I'm going to have my colleague Dee introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very similar to Pat, I was a Studer partner and fell in love with the work while I was a superintendent, and had also served as a high school and elementary principal, and loved the work so much that I joined the team as a coach leader about 4 years ago. And so excited to be here with you today. Always love to learn from Pat, and just am excited about school starting back, and we get to see the kids and get to learn about our new partners and all the great things that are happening across the United States with our partners and future partners.
For the people participating today, we encourage you to put questions into the chat. If you leave your contact information, we will follow back up to answer your questions. We'll also have the opportunity to pull in some of those thoughts and highlights into next week's session. When we think about the work that we do, for those of you who are familiar with us, you know that we work really intentionally to build that improvement process from the system level to those closest to the work. But the voice of those closest to the work really inform how do we improve the teams that we work with. When we think about building the strength of individual leaders and then collectively as the organization, how do we actually build that culture of care within individual teams at the school level, at the department level, across the system level, so that we can really use insights from those close to the work so that we can accelerate results across the system. As we think about new leaders, and we've all been there, you don't know what you don't know as you're heading into a new role. You think you understand the role of an assistant principal, but once you're in it, you really get that context of what is that day, that week, that work, how do people rely on you? And when we think about principal, assistant superintendent, we always have that view of what we think the role is before we get into it. So as we're building that leadership as a team, a few takeaways from today in the conversation we're going to have is just reinforce, don't go it alone. Modeling and expecting that deep listening. How do we do that for the leaders that we serve? How do we model that so that they in turn are doing it with their team members? How do we build those close conversations with your newest members of the team? And then how do we actually pause to think about what's most important and really making it explicit in the conversations that we're having as we're entering into the school year, and think about those shorter cycles of 30, 60, 90 days so that the important work becomes the key priority. And I'm going to share a couple of examples. Dee and I will have conversations around how do we scaffold clear communication and really be explicit with how we're taking the actions to do the follow through. I want you to think just for a minute, we've all had those people in our career who really made a difference for us in our careers. My example early in my career was Tom Joint. I had a number of colleagues that really made a difference for me. Tom was the one that really saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see at that time to really manage up that next step in leadership. Dee Dee, who was your person that really made a difference in your career?
My very first principal that I ever worked for. And it was just one of those situations that many of us have had where he just tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, "Hey, I just want to have a conversation with you. I know you're going to start your master's degree. Have you thought about administration?" And I'm sure that there's a lot of those conversations along the way on our educational journey, and we remember and treasure every one of those.
Yeah, really important, Dee Dee. And as we think about it, part of the tricky part in our work is we've all been really familiar with a variety of different leadership frameworks. So when we think about the leaders that make a difference and the leadership that makes a difference in a system, the research really indicates half of the attributes relate to how do we build strong teams, and half relate to how do we build strong systems? How do we create that line of sight for strategy to execution? So when we think about building the capabilities of leaders, this is career long, not year long. So whether they're a department leader, whether they're a coach, an instructional coach, and seeing the capabilities that they bring to a team, whether they're a night foreman and really building that capability of building that strong culture of the team members that they work with. When we're building strong leadership at every level, it's really related to how do we create that line of sight to results? How do we actually be really clear on what's most important to improve? How do we build that culture of care and service, that principle number 3 of we're here to serve one another well as the people that we serve out into the fields? And how do we actually build leaders so that they build their teams? So when we think about principle number 4, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize to everybody with that little raspy voice. We're really thinking about, we've got brand new leaders entering into roles where they're coming to work wanting to be the very best they can be for the teams that they serve. And part of that is how do we help them see around the corners so that they can build a great culture in their team, but really understand that we're one team across the system. And how do we build that line of sight so that their teamwork contributes to the organizational success as well? So as we build the conversation between today and next week, how do we actually help them see around those corners for us as one team? When we think about the balance of the principles focusing on employee care, that deep voice, being accountable, principle number 6 is you can count on me to follow through. Building aligned behaviors with goals and values, deep level of communication, and really aligning our feedback loops so that people can see their contributions make a difference beyond their individual job roles. The 9 principles have really been instrumental of how we build those leadership capabilities individually and collectively. And we're really going to dig into that notion of building leaders so that they can build those contributions in their own team. As we think about the notion of building leadership, the biggest way we can impact organizational success is to really scaffold that deep leadership. So every team can be thriving, every school and department sees that contribution. We feel part of one collective group so that if an individual leader transitions, they know that building that deep level of capability within their teams is really that foundation for success. Dee Dee, I know that you've worked really heavily with teams, and as we think about that entry level, regardless of role, the aligned values, how do we treat one another? How do we actually listen with care? How do we think about the people closest to the work? That's really the starting point to the work. Often new leaders will think about the outcomes And it's really reversing that focus on the people first, so that we're getting close, we're building that sense of relationship, so that everyone feels part of that outcomes, and individual leaders aren't feeling like they're carrying the load alone. So that people first mentality is really that opening part of that message. That culture of care and service to one another, as well as the people that we provide service to, and really then getting clear on what is important to focus on and improve, what are our priority strategic outcomes, and then being clear on strategy and execution to results. As we think about today, we're really staying on that first part of people first and that commitment to care, that deep listening. And that next session next week, we're really going to be talking about how do we get a little bit deeper in helping leaders see that strategy to execution and results as they're starting their new roles. Dee Dee, when you think about building that capability of the leaders and that deep listening, we often get in a trap with our leaders where we're thinking about the instructional side of the house and forgetting that we've got department leaders and directors on the operational side of the house. So as we think about that deep listening and doing that prioritization of making sure that we're reaching out to every leader, one of the things that I found helpful is when we think about leader rounding, I found it helpful to block time on my calendar on Wednesday morning. Wednesday was the time where I would block out about 90 minutes and specifically for those rounding conversations. When you think about your calendar, how did you make it intentional that you were blocking in that time for rounding?
Very similar to you, Pat. I blocked Friday morning because I wanted to make it a priority, and everybody knew that when that time was blocked, that was going to be my focus. Just a couple of points I want to add to what you said. And these are things that you and I've talked about before, but really meeting people where they are. And that it's people get focused on the outcomes, but it's really the relationship building of meeting them where they are and what's top of mind for them. Another thing that I've heard you say a lot, Pat, that I totally agree with is, everybody is a leader. Everybody can be a leader from the seat that they're in. And you will always ask, who is onboarding the second shift custodian, right? And so that second shift custodian and everybody in their role makes such a difference in the jobs that they're in as one community of learners and servant leaders. So I love this opportunity to really talk about that relationship building, and as you kick us off on rounding.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Dee Dee. And when we think about leader rounding, it's really elegantly simple. It's pausing 5-10 minutes. It's really about the individual, and are we removing barriers for them so they can be their very best? So as a superintendent, as I was rounding with a brand new principal or assistant principal, it's really making sure that we're knowing them outside of their job, what's important to them, what's important to them outside of work, pausing long enough to say what's working well for you in your role, making sure that if there's a challenge, how can I be helpful to you, knowing that we're heading into the year, they haven't necessarily done the navigation of the master schedule. They don't necessarily know all of their team members yet. And do they have the time and resources from me as the superintendent, as their colleague and support, so that they can do their jobs effectively? And pausing to know who on the team has been particularly helpful to them. When we think about that modeling and pausing to spend that time with their leaders, it's really reinforcing this is that priority work for them to be spending with their teams. Whether they're a high school principal, a director of transportation, they lead people first, and then we manage projects and work on improvement. If we're not spending that time to get to know the people that we're working alongside, the people aren't necessarily going to be worried all that much about what our strategic aims are. So it's really prioritizing that time with the people that we serve to make sure that they see it from us, and then they in turn model that for their newest team members. So that rounding protocol, we've got a lot of resources. I know some of you are familiar with it, but we've got a lot of examples as well as quick videos that will be helpful to you in order to start that process of deep listening. And what do we mean by that? You can't unearth the barriers in a system unless you're listening to the people closest to the work. When we think about what do we mean by improvement, it's elegantly simple. How do we remove barriers for students, for families, for our colleagues, for people that bump up against the system? How are we listening closely to what are the barriers they're experiencing so that we can bring teams together to problem solve around the right issues? The closer we're listening, the better we're actually able to remove what's getting teams stuck in order to improve the outcomes. It's often simple to think about improvement from that standpoint of we want to improve literacy, we want to improve math. Unless we're rounding with our team members, we aren't going to know. They aren't quite clear on the pacing guides. They aren't quite clear on what those short cycle assessments are. They don't quite have all of the resources that they need. We can have grand plans, but unless we're listening deeply, we're really not going to be in a position to lead our people well and support them as they in turn are listening and supporting the children that we serve. So when we think about rounding, when teams are healthy, we recommend doing it about once a quarter with teams during the course of the year. And when teams are under stress, we might accelerate that and do small group rounding or a team huddle so that we're thinking about getting together with them 2 times a week, once a week, as we're edging into the year to make sure everyone is feeling supported. As we're thinking about our brand new team members, now's the time that at the end of August, moving into September, they might be working for 30 days into the role, pausing again with them to say, tell me a little bit more about you, so that we're getting to know a little bit more about the person, not just the job title. In the first few weeks on the job, do you have what you need? How is your experience in comparison to what we said, the role was going to be as you were being interviewed and hired? What's working well? Do you have any ideas for us to improve? And is there anything that's not feeling right for you right now so that we can make sure that we're taking action if anything is feeling tender? And again, who's been helpful to you so that we can actually thank the people who are really making a contribution to building that broader sense of team. So as we think about rounding is a foundational piece, that 30-day interview as we're bridging into that year. What we want to remember as we're aligning the work of the system, Dee, often when new leaders start, they're thinking about that red fish as the superintendent or as the school board, or they're thinking about it as the building principal that they're working with. And in reality, when we think about improvement as a system, we're really thinking about what are the core values on how we treat one another, how are we showing up for work with one another, how do we provide feedback in an effective way? What are those guiding principles for how we're going to lead together as one team so that as individuals change, as assistant principals become principals, principals become directors or superintendents, the direction of the system doesn't change because we're really grounding it in something deeper than an individual. We're grounding it in that set of beliefs and that set of the routines that really help the system work. As we think about that work ahead, Dee, as we were working into the year, and as you said it well, we get trapped in that mindset of as we're onboarding employees, we often think about our certified staff, we think about our teachers, we think about our instructional coaches and our team leaders. And we often forget about how do we do the onboarding for the entire team. What does that look like for our special education aides who are working with our most vulnerable children? How do we help leaders think about their new night custodians that are working in really isolating type of positions, but how do we actually reach out to them and be really intentional with making sure that they feel part of that team? So as we were thinking about moving into the start of the school year, we really paused to think about how do we onboard every team member together as a team. So when we were hiring, regardless if it was a substitute teacher or a night custodian or our director of HR, how do we actually pull those people together in onboarding sessions, regardless of job position, and really go through our culture of care and service for one another? What are our core values? How do we work together as a team? What would be job specific development and mentoring available to them regardless of job role? And how do we actually get everyone thinking about we're one team working toward that improvement of service, working toward that improvement of safety and our protocols around efficiency and effectiveness, and our instructional improvement efforts. So as we were thinking about building those opportunities, we were really figuring out how do we pause so that everyone feels part of that team environment. Dee Dee, what were your insights as you were welcoming all of the team members to your team?
Well, many times new staff that come to you may not be from that hometown, from that school district. And so research shows us that if new employees are able to make a friend for lunch, somebody that maybe they connect with through this process of onboarding, 30-day, 90-day conversations and rounding, then they're more likely to stay with us because they make the connections not only to the work, but most importantly to the people they're working alongside and to the students. So I think that is so impactful. Especially as we try to recruit and re-recruit staff every year.
Yeah, really important, Dee Dee. And building that sense of how do we provide that interdependency, across team roles, make everyone feel that line of sight that their roles are mission critical, and making sure that people understand we can't do this job alone if we aren't building that strong sense of team. In this outline, I shared just some insights of you see, as we were thinking about onboarding and the development process for all employees. I also highlighted what were some of the things that we really focused on as we did our leadership development over time, our board development, and really building those next level leaders so that within every team, we had that ability to tap the shoulder, as Dee Dee indicated, that tapping the shoulder of those leaders that you see as those next level leaders, regardless of what the job roles are. And you're going to have some teams that will benefit from a deeper level of development on project management, decision making, your advanced improvement processes and problem solving. It's some of the work that we do coast to coast with teams as we're working on root cause analysis and getting a little bit deeper with how do we solve those wicked challenges. Not everyone on your team needs that level of depth and development, but it is helpful as you're building those capabilities across the teams that you serve. As we think about that onboarding, I've had the great pleasure of working with an organization, El Dorado County Office of Ed, and really their focus of onboarding has really been a target for them, where they had every leader really pause to say, let's spend some time making explicit that outreach to new employees around what their first day, first week, first month schedules are going to look like, so that we're paying really close attention to what their needs are, what they're wondering about, so that as we're rounding with them, it can complement that really intentional communication. They've spent time really outlining what the role-specific training is, from their bus drivers doing, drive-alongs with experienced drivers, getting their safety training really intentional around that care for those drivers, which boosted up their retention and their ability to meet those individual needs. There's special education aides. I'm working with another team where they shadow for a week before they're deployed in that individual job responsibility, and they pause to do a team huddle at the end of the week of saying, do you have the support that you need? When we think about first grade teachers, third grade teachers, we're often really, it's really obvious to us that we need to do that onboarding and that mentoring and that support. But we have a lot of people across our system that are 100% responsible for the safety of our children and the training of the ability to provide that support with the team members that they serve. As we think about the highest priority work, and we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about this next week as well, but how do we help leaders see now, next, and later? What are those things coming up the next 4 weeks that are really important that they know? And then how do we make sure that they see around the corner 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, so that as we're thinking about that leadership, it's not tag, you're it, now you're responsible, but we're working as a team to think about in those increments of 30, 60, 90-day planning. We're doing that peek around the corner of what's important, and we're getting really explicit with who's taking that next action. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this as we think about next week, from that initial planning, what are those key priorities, and then how can we get teams really thinking in those smaller action steps so that we're building that engine of the improvement cycles over time. And how do we make sure that the scaffold of information doesn't just stay within the leadership team? How do we get intentional about those clear action steps and making sure all staff are aware of what's coming around the corner? Are we on track with the work that we said was important to be on track with? And making sure that people have that voice in the process collectively and individually as we're working with the teams that we serve. As we think about that work ahead, daily, weekly, Dee Dee and I shared, we would schedule rounding on Wednesday mornings, but daily, weekly, you're working at how do you build that two-way deep listening in your team meetings? How do you make sure that you're putting information out to all staff, but then bringing the themes of rounding back as you're pulling your leadership team meetings together? And how do you actually think out ahead of building those routines for the improvement cycles as you go? One of the things with your new leaders, they often get in their own heads, as we all do, as we're building into, we want to do the best job we can. They want to impress you. Be really explicit of, we know you don't know, what's coming around the corner. We know you want to work really hard, but really make sure that you're staying curious with them. How can we be most helpful to you? And reinforcing that if we thought you knew, and as we're building that level of leadership, building that time with them so that they know that you're serious about, we're not expecting you to have all of the answers. We're expecting you to lead with the team that you serve to discover what are the barriers that are blocking the work of the teams so that we can problem solve that effectively together. As we do that peek around the corner to next week, we're going to really be going back to, how do we know what's most important to improve? How do we think about the measures that are going to matter most? How do we get into those little measures, not the big measures? Because the big measures typically don't inform our next actions because they're too slow. How do we support our leaders in pausing to look for the bright spots? And how do we grow the capability for really leading with an evidence-based leadership framework as a full team? We can't call ourselves leaders or improvers unless the impact of our work really builds the capability of the teams that we serve, unless it's removing the barriers for the people that are closest to that work, and then ultimately, unless the outcomes improve. So as we think about that work ahead, that's the work that we want to build in that mindset of we're one team, we're in this together, and we want to build the capability of the leaders at every level of the organization. We're going to really talk next week about how do we get aligned for that impact. And we're going to spend a bit of time really teasing through how do you work together to make sure that your goals are clear, your development is aligned, you're really clear on those always actions that you're committing to, and your feedback loops are tightly connected to what right looks like. So we're going to spend a little bit more time here next week. Dee Dee, it's always a pleasure to spend the time together. I'm excited to spend the time next week. We also will spend a little bit more time talking about what's right in education, which will be in Colorado. It's a time of year where executive team leaders come together. It's a conference of about 300, 350 people of the executive leaders of the system sharing the stories around what steps are they learning make the biggest difference for improving their outcomes. So Dee Dee, it's always a pleasure. Look forward to spending the time next week. Any final thoughts as we wrap up this morning?
All I'd say is that back to school is a busy time. Learning comes in the pause. So make sure you're intentional to take the time to pause and get to know those that you are serving alongside. Thanks, Pat.
So friends who are participating, any questions you have, pop them in the chat. We'll be following up with additional resources and look forward to continuing the conversation next week.